Imagine being told the war might end today. You won't have to charge a hill or cross open ground. You won't have to run toward gunfire. You'll wait. And then, the earth will open. For weeks, men have been digging beneath the battlefield. They were miners by trade, but soldiers by honor. Working in darkness, breathing air pumped through a wooden box, carrying dirt out in wooden cracker boxes. 500 feet underground, they packed the tunnel with gunpowder. Tons of it. Enough to tear the ground apart. The plan is simple. When the explosion comes, the enemy line disappears, and the army just walks through. They are told not to hesitate, stop, or look down, because once the ground opens, the hole won't just be empty. It will be waiting. By 1864, the Civil War had gone on far longer than anyone had expected. Casualties were staggering. Northern morale was shaky. Early on, many believed the war would be short, almost clarifying. One big confrontation, and the Union would be restored. That belief was so common that civilians traveled from Washington to watch the fighting. They brought refreshments, chairs, opera glasses. There was live music. They expected a show. They got a rout. By 1864, that illusion was gone. The war hadn't clarified anything. It had hardened. What was supposed to be quick had turned into something else entirely. A grinder. And Petersburg, Virginia, sat right in its teeth. Just south of Richmond, Petersburg was a Confederate choke point, a railroad hub, a supply hub. An army that cannot be fed, paid, or supplied cannot remain in the field for long. As long as the South held Petersburg, Richmond could keep fighting. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would soon follow. But Petersburg did not fall. By June of 1864, the fighting had hardened into a siege. Trench warfare, once considered to be an old world horror, now surrounded the town. It was a stalemate. Repeated frontal assaults had failed. More charges meant more dead and no progress. The Union needed a breakthrough. That's when a different idea emerged. Soldiers from the 48th Pennsylvania, many of them coal miners in civilian life, proposed something radical. Dig a tunnel beneath the Confederate position. Pack it with explosives. Blow the line apart. It wasn't standard warfare. It was risky, unorthodox. But it was one of the few ideas left that might actually break the deadlock. On paper, the plan worked. There was one more part of the plan. One that mattered more than any map. The troops selected to lead the attack were United States colored troops. They had trained specifically for this moment. They were drilled to move around the crater, not into it. To keep moving, to widen the breach, to turn chaos into momentum. They volunteered for the most dangerous position, because success meant proof. Proof that black soldiers could fight, lead, and win. But on the eve of the attack, the plan changed. Union commanders worried about optics. If the assault failed, and many expected it might, they feared the sight of black troops dying in large numbers would cause political backlash at home. So the trained units were pulled, at the last moment, replaced by white regiments who had not rehearsed the maneuver, who had not been trained to avoid the crater. The whole stayed. The plan didn't. The explosion was meant to do three things: destroy a Confederate fortification, create a gap in the line, and allow Union troops to pour through before anyone could recover. The explosion was not the problem. What happened next was. The blast was supposed to go off before dawn, but it didn't. The fuse failed. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Dawn crept closer. Finally, 2 volunteers crawled into the tunnel, found the dead splice, and lit it again. At 4:44 a.m., the ground didn't shake. It disappeared. What was left behind wasn't a breach. It was a pit. A crater more than 100 feet long and 30 feet deep. Its sides steep loose and unstable. Men at the front didn't know what they were looking at. Smoke, dust, bodies, silence where a fort had been. And then they did the most human thing possible. They went into it. Instead of moving around the crater, troops poured down into it, sliding, stumbling, climbing over each other because it felt like cover. It wasn't. Inside the crater, formations disappeared. Officers lost sight of their men. Orders couldn't travel up or down the slope. Every path forward bottlenecked into the same hole. Above them, Confederate soldiers recovered faster than expected. They reached the rim. They looked down. And the crater became a bowl. Rifles fired straight into it. Artillery was dragged forward and angled downward. Grenades, simple shells with fuses, were dropped by hand. Men tried to climb out. The dirt gave way. They slid back down. The crater filled with smoke, with bodies, with noise that couldn't organize itself into commands. Units that were supposed to lead never arrived. Units that arrived didn't know where to go. Minutes stretched into hours. What was meant to be a breakthrough turned into a traffic jam of men. Standing, crouching, hiding, dying, all in the same place. The hole didn't move. The soldiers did. And every decision pushed more of them into it. Petersburg didn't fall in a day. It collapsed slowly, trench by trench, railroad by railroad, decision by decision. When the firing finally slowed, the crater wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a containment. Men trapped inside were surrounded on all sides. No cover, no way forward, no way back. Some tried to surrender. What happened next depended on who they were. White Union soldiers were often taken prisoner. Black soldiers were not. United States colored troops, some of whom had been pulled from the lead role, others fed piecemeal into the disaster, were shot where they stood. Bayoneted, clubbed, killed after laying down their arms. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't heat of the moment. Confederate policy was clear. Black soldiers were not legitimate combatants. They were not entitled to surrender. The crater became more than a military failure. It became a massacre. By mid-morning, the attack was over. What remained was a battlefield no one wanted to look at too closely. Bodies layered in loose dirt, weapons buried beside them, wounded men calling out, sometimes for hours, before the heat and the smoke finished the job. Union losses reached nearly 4,000 in less than half a day. The Confederates lost a fraction of that. The breakthrough never came. And then came the question that always follows disasters. Who was responsible? The answer, as usual, was complicated and unsatisfying. The men who dug the tunnel weren't blamed. The explosion worked exactly as designed. The engineering was sound. The mine did its job. The failure came after. From decisions made far from the front. From hesitation. From fear. From leaders more worried about appearances than outcomes. General Ambrose Burnside, the man in overall command, was removed. Several officers were court-martialed. Careers ended. Reputations collapsed. But no one was punished for pulling the trained black units at the last moment. No one was punished for sending unprepared troops into a plan they didn't understand. The system absorbed the loss and moved on. In Washington, the news hit hard. President Lincoln followed the campaign closely. He understood what Petersburg meant. He understood what had been lost. He reportedly called the battle the saddest affair I have witnessed in the war. Not the bloodiest, not the most expensive, the saddest. Because this wasn't failure born of necessity. It wasn't the cost of trying something impossible. The plan had worked. The troops had trained. The moment was there. What failed was the nerve to see it through. For black soldiers, the lesson was unmistakable. They had volunteered, trained, prepared to lead. And when the moment came, they were deemed too risky to trust, too politically dangerous to sacrifice, even as they were sacrificed anyway. Despite this, United States colored troops continued to fight. They fought at New Market Heights. They fought outside Richmond. They fought knowing surrender might not save them. By war's end, nearly 180,000 black men had served the Union. Their record would help decide the war. But the crater would remain a warning about what happens when courage outruns leadership. Petersburg did not fall that day. The siege dragged on for months. But it did fall. Trench by trench, railroad by railroad. Not with a sudden breakthrough, but with relentless pressure. When Petersburg finally collapsed, Richmond followed, and with it, the Confederacy. The crater is still there, a scar in the earth. Tourists walk its rim, children peer into it. Grass grows where men once stood shoulder to shoulder waiting for orders that never came. It's remembered as a military disaster, but that's only part of the story. The Battle of the Crater wasn't just about a hole in the ground. It was about fear overriding preparation, politics overriding planning, and the cost of refusing to trust the very people who had trained to succeed. The earth opened exactly as promised. What failed was everything that came after. Everybody went into the hole, not because the plan demanded it, but because leadership let it happen. If you're still here, thanks. I've got more stories like this that the history books left out. Drop a like. Hit subscribe. Welcome to the Underground Syllabus.